Congratulating an entrepreneur on raising funds is like congratulating a chef on buying vegetables.
Yeah.
It's the input, bro.
I've heard
It's
this.
the input.
Yes.
It's not the output. The dish has to be made. Someone has to pay for it. Someone has to love it and love it enough that they come back for it. That's the job. We all have two money lives, and the second one starts when we realize that we have enough for one. Would you be a proud owner of a 5 to 600 crore company, profitable, market leader? I think most people will say yes.
Absolutely.
But we were a failure. The outcome needs to be in multiple billions of dollars. If you do not have, on day one, the confidence and the surety that you will be that, you're setting yourself up for failure. It's suicidal. I often feel that most happy people, their resting heart rate is below 55. They're not pumping.
You should check yours. I was thinking of mine. Welcome to the Indian Silicon Valley podcast. I'm your host Jibraj, and today I'm back with another very special episode, one that I've been waiting for a very, very long time. Join me in welcoming the very famous, a man who needs very little introduction, Ankur Warikoo. Thank you so much, Ankur, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad we made it after a bit of back and forth, but it's always a pleasure to be speaking to you.
That's very, very kind of you. I actually had a lot of fond memories of talking to you. I was lucky enough to interact with you in early 2020 for a page that I was running on Instagram. That was a written story. Then I hosted you for the podcast when it was in audio form. So I distinctly remember being awed by all the amazing things you were doing back then. And I think that was when you were at about 10-20K followers on Instagram. And of course, the world has now known the brilliance that you have to offer. But it's amazing to observe from the outside what you've been able to do as an entrepreneur. The way you define entrepreneurship also, I think in Shantanu's episode you mentioned that it's about taking the resources you have and providing disproportionate positive value to the world. And I think that's been visible all across. And I'm so glad that you agreed to do this again. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm very excited because, I've had all of this curiosity every time I've looked at you on the social persona, and I want to bring all of that curiosity on the table today. Where I want to start, and I'm going to have a tough time bringing this to an original conversation because a lot of your story is out there for right reason, but I'm trying to do a good job at it. Where I want to start is actually in a very abstract note, but one of the things that is very evident in your life is you seem to have this very fulfilled, well-rounded life. On a day-to-day basis, you're not chasing this, ambitious goal which may just turn out to be something else a couple of years later. But on the personal, professional, travel, wealth, all of these aspects, it just feels like you are doing really well. You're joyous, you're happy. Talk to us about what that means, Ankur. A lot of people are actually fundamentally chasing that, although they may not claim that out loud. But what does a fulfilled life mean for you on a day-to-day basis, and how do you practice it, and how can one perhaps take cues from that? I think that'll be the best way to start.
That's a fascinating question to start with. I'll start with a very recent example. Right this morning, before I came in here, my wife and I, we're in the washroom getting ready, and she looks at me and she's like, "I'm really excited for this evening." And I was like, I can't believe it. You are feeling this way because I'm also really excited for this evening. And what's happening this evening is that we're all going for Kung Fu Panda 4. And for me and for her, this is genuinely the best definition of what life has to offer. The fact that 4 of us as a family are looking forward to something as trivial as a movie, but we are, and it's not that we haven't seen movies together or it's like this rare occurrence. It's happened a lot of times, but we just so look forward to spending time with each other in a way that we're also entertained, in a way that we share things with each other and celebrate life for no occasion, for no reason, for no moment specifically, but just the fact that we're together. And I have come to appreciate this about life so much, Jivraj, because I was at the exact opposite end of the spectrum, which you in many ways describe. People tend to be chasing, they don't even know what, but they are, whether it's money, whether it's fame, whether it's recognition, whether it's growth, whether it's a feeling of fulfillment. And it's a fascinating thing to know that you have enough, that you just have enough. And enough is so powerful because when you know you have enough, you then choose to live life your own way. And then it defines everything, whether it's money and how much you're chasing, whether at all you're chasing, whether it's professional success or your endeavors, whether it's your ambition, whether it's your personal life, whether it's solitude. it just changes everything for you, and it certainly has for me. So health, wealth, relationships, I'm the fittest that I've ever been. I have more money, frankly, than I know how to individually spend. We are a family of very few means. We are very comfortable with the life that we have. We don't chase materialistic goals. We spend an inordinate amount of our money on travel and experiences, and we love that, and we wouldn't trade that for anything. And we have lovely relationships, not a lot, but individually, my wife and I, we are independent, and at the same time, we love to share our life together, where we're not dependent on the other person for our own happiness, but we take responsibility for our own. And it's a fascinating life, because you just wake up every day not feeling any pressure to be somebody, and you're truly at peace with who you are. Yeah. And this morning I woke up, was opening Twitter, and I read this post by Shanpuri, who said, what's a sure sign or a telltale sign that a person is truly happy? And that set me thinking, like, what's because people can claim to be happy, but you never know whether they are or not. But what's like a sure sign that they are? And I feel it's a combination of multiple things. So I mentioned 5, and I'll try to remember all 5. One is that there is this. In no way, by the way, I'm referring to myself when I say these 5 things now, so please don't take it otherwise. One, I often find that people who are really content or very happy, they have this unmissable glow on their face. You can't miss it. There is this genuine glow on their face, and it's nothing to do with old age and nothing to do with their skin routine or anything like that. Second, they're usually very kind even to unkind people, because they don't have any reason to be not kind. Third, they are often smiling than not. And you would find a laugh or a smile on a face, and it's usually very pleasant, very inviting. Fourth, they would typically not feel the need to impress anybody, because they're just at peace with who they are. And fifth, which is a rather stupid thing, there's no data backing it up. I often feel that most happy people, their resting heart rate is below 55. They're not pumping. They're not, because it's just calmness. Like Hindi में बोलते हैं समता. वो धोनी mode होता है ना, where you're not overly happy, you're not overly sad. You just almost feel like you're tranquilized, but you're not. You're in that zone. And the resting heartbeat is almost symbolic of that.
Oh, lovely. We should check yours. I was thinking of mine, but no, this is amazing. I think just as you are describing it also, there's a lot of comfort in your explanation that shows, and that's evident. One thing that I'd love to, dive deeper into is a lot of this feels acquired, and still we're chasing. For folks who are at a point where, it's easy to make the argument that, you have recognition, you have wealth, which is why you can make this sort of remark. But it shouldn't be a goalpost, right? So what do you think for folks who are still trying to chase a point where maybe livelihood is dependent on something, where maybe things are not as free, you're in control of your time, which is something you've often mentioned. What do you think folks who are still WIP, for the lack of a better sort of definition, can do to have the same feeling or be closer to that fulfillment feeling on a day-to-day basis?
I feel the biggest threshold, and I wouldn't say eligibility, but threshold, is just money. If you really think about it and you really boil it down, money is often a threshold, and an important one at that. But what baffles me is that most people don't know what their threshold is. Like, what are they truly chasing? So if you really see, people seem to be running this race where they have no idea where the finish line is. So they will keep perpetually running. Okay. I remember making this video nearly 2.5 years back, which was, how much money do you really need to live life? And it's one of my favorite videos. It did decent, not over the top, because it didn't fulfill that gratification that people often need from a YouTube video. But what I described, and I've been doing it for nearly 20 years now, so it's not a recent phenomenon that now that I have the money I can claim to. I remember back at the age of 24 or 25, that's when I first sat down to say, hey, how much money does one really need in life? Because the answers often were meaningless. Some people were like, 200-300 crore, right? Which is some obnoxious number. Or the other complete sainthood, which was 5-10 lakh. Like, none of which truly makes any sense practically. And I did what is a very normal present value calculation of your future needs. Things that you already are aware of, things that you can plan for, and some contingency which is built in to the extent of 25-30% and not like 5-10%. And I came up with a number. That number was about 21 crores for me. It was also really big because at that point of time, and still, one of my big aims is to go to Mars. And I have assigned nearly a fairly 6-7 crores, hoping that Elon Musk does a good job of that pricing in that range. So about $1 million or so for that. But 21 CR, if I have today, I can put that money passively into a engine and keep withdrawing money to live my life, fulfill all of my needs. What that means is once you hit that threshold, you ought to live a different life. But your life until you hit that threshold will be by design different. And that is how I think of life. As Confucius famously said, we all have two lives and we realize that, we all have two lives. And the second one starts when we realize that we just have one. Yeah. And in the same manner, we all have two money lives. And the second one starts when we realize that we have enough for one. And I think that's the big distinction. Once you get to that point, everything else is under control. Whether it's time, whether it's relationships, whether it's your health, whether it's anything else. It's a function of how you look at your life and how you wish to lead it. It's all in your hands. Yeah. Money may be out of it, but I'd say work your ass off to get to that threshold. You'll be surprised how sooner than you imagined you can actually get to it. And once you get to it, stop chasing and live the second life that you ought to and you deserve to. Wow. And it took me nearly 40 years to get to that point. But I'm glad because I hope I have another 40 to live the second life that I lucked into and now get to enjoy.
No, that's lovely. I think I'll take away the fact that you need to know your number almost dynamically as well, perhaps. Like for me, the way I define it is, what do I need at 25? What do I need at 30? What do I need at 35? And that I think also simplifies because then you can compare almost what you wanted and where you are. Yeah. And you just understand the alpha is actually worth it to give you freedom to do and pursue other things. So. I really concur. But this has been very interesting, a very interesting start to the podcast. The other trail, I was hoping that we can go into, different parts of your life. But instead of doing that, I want to maybe pick a trail that's been very, very evident in your journey, yet very natural to you. Outside in looking, it feels like the risk-taking ability that you've exhibited has been significant, be it dropping out of, a PhD, coming back. The decision to go to ISB in its 5th year, one could also argue was decently risky, considering it was not as, famous a school. The aspiration was, and still continues to be, the IIMAs. Of course, ISB has done an incredible job at setting up a premier institution in the country. But then, leaving consulting to join startups when, again, startups were not the thing, right? This is in 2011. Nine. So then post that also in 2019, you started, in fact, YouTube in 2017, if I'm not wrong. You started LinkedIn very early. These are not risky things with limited downside, yet enough to say that either you had strong foresight or you were okay enough to take fluid risk with your life. Talk to us about how that shaped your thinking, your ability to pursue things that shaped your life, and how do you look at just risk and foresight in general? I'd be really fascinated to get your mental model on it.
Sure. So one's approach towards risk and failure, I believe, is a muscle that one can easily build. I often say this, the best way to learn how to deal with failure is to practice failing every day. But do it in a manner that the cost is really low. For example, go and walk up to somebody and ask for 500 rupees. You don't know what's going to happen. But what happens and the way you react to it will build your muscle. It's literally like lifting weights. You don't know what happens when you lift a 5. But when you lift a 5, the next month you can lift a 7, and then a 9, and then an 11. And our body, including our mind, is built and designed to adapt. Because we are animals of survival. It's pure biology and evolution. The more you read Charles Darwin, the more you recognize how everything follows the same pattern and as for millions of years. And we're just a speck in a moment of time trying to imagine that we are bigger than all of that. We're not. We can easily be passive in our approach and just let nature take over, doing the right things that we ought to. For me, that big moment of building that muscle was dropping out of my PhD. And I do agree, I can't pinpoint how I got that courage to do so. If I were to truly put my hand on my heart, I think the big reason was because I was on a scholarship. And ironically, that scholarship made it easy for me to opt out of it because there was no personal money involved. Somebody else had paid for that experience. And I don't know how I would have reacted if it were our own money and then the complete loss fallacy. Oh my God, this will be my money and this will be our hard earned wealth just being destroyed because somebody decided that they don't want to pursue it. But whatever the reasons are, I took that call. And I remember when I took that call, there was this wave of courage that came in because here I was destroying my best ever plan of my life with my own hands and still okay. Like I wasn't dead. I still had myself. I still had my family. It was a tough period, but I still had myself. And I could bet on myself. And I very quickly decided that the first thing I had to do was get financial stability. So when I came back, incidentally, exactly 20 years back in March 2004 was when I was back. And by April, mid or so, I had a job. And the job paid me a handsome 15,000 rupees in hand, which was more money than I thought that I'll ever make because why would anybody give me a job? I had nothing to show. And I worked really hard for that. And then there were clearly signs from people saying, hey, if you want to pivot, an MBA is a good degree. And ISB came along serendipitously, as you mentioned, 5-year-old school, insanely expensive. Yeah. So I would have had to take a mega loan on that. But again, the failure and the risk muscle had started building. And the way that I interpreted what I should do was, hey, what's the worst thing that can happen? And the worst thing that can happen was I was earning 15,000 rupees a month. The EMI of that 15 lakh rupee loan that I would take for ISB would be about 20,000 a month. And my question was, if I get into ISB and I work hard, could I get a job that paid me 35,000 rupees in hand? And the answer was yes, conclusively yes. I'll have to be a big duffer not to even get that, which I knew I wasn't. So I was like, great, that's a good gamble to take. I leave being exactly where I was, but with the added experience of ISB, the added network of which I had no idea how it would help, and it's helped me immensely, and just the exposure because I knew nothing about the real world. And it just changed my life. I tweeted about that experience where I was at 2.75 lakhs per annum in my first job before ISB. My first job out of ISB was 12 lakhs an annum. And in less than 2 years, I was earning 33 lakhs an annum. And it is wild when I think about that because I cannot wrap my head around that. I don't think anybody with a sane mind can, but it happened. And I think it happened because I just took a bet on myself and thankfully the bet worked. If it didn't work, I was okay with what would be the worst case scenario. And that's the same logic I keep applying to my life. My worst case is covered. It's covered. We're so privileged. Our parents have done all the hard work. We're never going to die of hunger or poverty. We're now set up on a nice, happy base. And the worst thing that can happen is what? We'll have to sell our house. Like that's the worst case. We'll have to sell something that we own and be actually in the money. And that was the scenario in 2020 when COVID happened and I had 5 months of money in the bank. We're like, we'll just sell our house. And my wife and I agreed that that was the right thing to do. And we would make about 50 lakhs or 40 lakhs or so as the down payment we'd made for the house. And that would be enough for us to live our entire life in a village, homeschool our kids, be like some primary school teacher in some government school and whatnot, and still be happy because we had our health and we had our family around. And I think it's beautiful because it's liberating. It's liberating when you recognize that the sheer assets you work towards don't own you, but you own them, and they ought to work for you when you are in shit. Because if they can't, then you are a slave to them.
Yeah.
And all of that, these fancy phones and these stupid clothes and these cars and these houses, they ought to be at your command to be just sold or disposed of whenever you need it because you worked hard to get them in the first place. Yeah. So why wouldn't they work hard for you when the need be? Our risks are covered. I really, really implore people to convince me or convince themselves of what's the worst case that can happen to them. Yeah. And it's amazing how often the worst case is actually the best case for so many people out there.
Yeah. And often inconsequential as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Most of life is reversible. I 100% am a firm believer in that. Most decisions we make are reversible. We believe them to be irreversible, and that's why we fret over them so much. But most decisions are reversible in the sense that you can always come back to where you started from and start all over again. And it'll take you to a new path new experience, perhaps the same outcome, but you'll never know until you do.
No, absolutely. I think that's wonderfully articulated and something that needs to be echoed further. I see a lot of people around as well who suffer from the fact that they don't want to make the hard decision in the short run, but that ends up really struggling for the long run. I think it really impacts the long run. But this is very, very helpful. On the right brain activity of having foresight in some of these decisions, did you, looking back in hindsight, have the calculation to say that okay, ISB could have a great network, entrepreneurship is the future, content is the future. You recently spoke in an interview about how you should look at social media platforms and maybe look at the up and coming ones. You mentioned about gas, right? How do you look at some of these things, or is it more recent? In the moment, did you make all of these decisions knowing maybe 1% that these could, I could luck out and these could be the right places to be?
I certainly can't claim to have any foresight. If any of my predictions come true, it's just luck. There's very little intelligence, if at all, and I sit down and make my own predictions. But frankly, I don't have a basis for those, so I can't backtrack them. I'll give you a good example. There are often I don't buy individual stocks because I'm not an expert. I can read financial reports, but I don't know what the future of a company can be or could be or should be. So I'm a very passive investor. I love these portfolio stocks. There are people who do this 24/7. I'll happily park my money with them. But I often think about companies and industries and market leaders in those industries. So I'll make predictions. And what I would then do is just buy one stock with the prediction and note it down for the future, just to see how I am doing, if at all. So my portfolio on Zerodha will be like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and a bunch of these ones. And even the US stocks, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, a bunch of these ones, because then you get access to your annual reports and you can also hear the EGMs and blah, blah. But that's pretty much as far as I go. I certainly don't make them public, and I don't make predictions. If somebody asks for my point of view, I can share my point of view, but with the nuance that, look, it's a idiot's point of view, and don't take it seriously, because you'll be the idiot if you do. And it's very easy for me to sit here and have this podcast with you, but that's also just survivorship bias, because I survived, and thousands of people who took the exact same decisions that I would have, of dropping out of dropping out of your PhD, going to a new school, or dropping out of your consulting to join a startup, or to become a startup founder, or to quit that to go into content. These are, in my opinion, decisions that a lot of people are taking on a daily basis. But unfortunately, there aren't as many outcomes as I have claimed to get. So I would not attribute any of that to either my hard work or my intelligence. It's just right place, right time. Maybe it's destiny. The more I'm reading about spirituality, it just seems to be the game. If I were to use the word, everything is just written, and we can all claim that we are working hard and we are people of free will, but even our beliefs or non-belief in destiny is written. So it's fascinating, and I don't go into that. Yeah. But I genuinely just try to keep my mind active by coming up with these predictions, and I'd say there's a 50% chance that they will, or they're like, so that's literally a tossing the coin.
Got it. No, very interesting, because looking, at your career trajectory just seems so fascinating, almost mind-blowingly how the dots have connected, and how things just compound. Yet in the moment, it could feel like there were so many different divergences, but very interesting. I want to get to entrepreneurship now. I think in 2009, what you started doing, which seemed natural to you, again, was very unheard of, very new in the country, plausibly very risky. Yet you had a very terrific time at all of your stints. Of course, there were difficult times as well that you've documented. But I want to understand if you can help us with almost imagery of what the ecosystem felt like back in the day, and to now what it's become, with all the stardom to founders, with all the Shark Tank like events, which are all great because it promotes a very strong sense of starting businesses in the country, which we've always promoted, but now it's happening on a mainstream level. Yeah. But what was it like back then? how were companies being built vis-a-vis what it's like now?
It was a very different and a fascinating time. And I think the fact that we're sitting in Delhi NCR, it's reflective of how the city is. And what I mean by that is the following. There is insane wealth in Delhi NCR.
Yeah.
In fact, across the country. And when I say insane, I mean unbelievable wealth, which if you were to meet the person or the owner, you would not for the love of you even second guess once what their net worth could be. But they're staying in fancy houses and they drive fancy cars and they have fancy lives and nobody knows of them. And in the early days of internet entrepreneurship, that was exactly the case, where there were people who thought they weren't, but they thought that they would make an insane amount of money because it was the internet and digital was exploding and there was leverage built and so on. But nobody cares. Nobody cared and nobody knew. And nobody would know of them at all. So it was like this chase with your own self, your fight with your own ambition, your aspirations. And there certainly wasn't any social construct to it of, hey, let me become like this popular person that I could be right now. And when you look at Sanjeev Vikchandani, you look at Deep Kalra, you look at Hitesh Oberoi, the OGs of the internet, if you will, they're very unassuming. They don't even understand what this social reputation is. Now they're getting a lot more of it and people are calling them OGs, but they're like, yaar, humne to ghisa mira ke apni bas company chalani thi. We just had to ensure that Make My Trip didn't die, Naukri didn't die, and Rediff didn't die. And those were just the challenges. The challenge was not, oh, how popular am I? And are people recognizing me? Are they clicking selfies? Okay. Which was a very pure way of doing it and also just one-sided because all that there was survival of your startup. There wasn't enough money. There certainly wasn't funding as glamorous as it is. There weren't fancy exits. And every day was a grind. What that meant was you were very clued into this one objective. And I loved that because there was very little distraction. And if at all there was distraction, that was from within the business itself. So you as a founder could be distracted by all the things that were happening in the business, but that was just your own local sphere. You weren't looking at somebody else because there weren't too many people outside. You certainly weren't looking at what people were thinking of you because there wasn't any. You weren't looking for the Forbes 30 under 30 or Fortune 40 under 40 because there weren't any. You weren't looking for funding because there wasn't any. You weren't looking at Shark Tank because there wasn't any. It was just very centered and focused around, I have to make sure that this baby of mine survives and stands on its own feet. And even if it does, my job will still not be over because, who knows? I remember Deep Kalra saying, hey, when we went public, I thought, that's it, great. And little did I know that's when the real journey started. And he's been at it since then. Yeah. But no, it still continues. Today, I feel that I don't envy the founders of today because they almost have to play multiple roles. It's not just survival of their own startup. It's also fundraising, which is necessary in many ways. It is also public persona, which is almost mandated and is thrust upon them. It is about their own PR and how people perceive them. It's about the employer brand that they have to build. It's about their own lifestyle, which people want to dig into. It's about their thought leadership, which people keep probing them on. And it's just so many different things that there is bound to be loss of focus on that one thing that is truly the most important thing that you have to do. And that is to ensure that your startup survives. Forget grows and thrives, just survives as the first cut. And that's true for how the generation is as well. They're not startup founders, but I don't envy the generation of today because they have it immensely hard. They are being compared to literally everybody on the planet as against the small group of comparison that we had growing up. My comparison was like 50 kids at best. Kids from school, kids from the colony. That was it. Like, so when mom and dad scolded us, if at all they did, that, no, look at Sharma ji ke bete ko dekho. The Sharma ji ko beta was a real entity. Like, I knew that bloke. But now that Sharma ji an entity could be anyone in the universe who could be cracking a crore job at 12 or making shitloads of money because there's some prodigy or something like that. And then there is distraction of content. And then there is distraction of FOMO. And then there is distraction of the choices that exist that they could pursue. It's not engineer ban jao, lawyer ban jao. Now it's like, oh, you can become a prompt engineer, whatever the F that means. So there are just so many of these that it is an insanely hard world to live in. It's an insanely hard world to live in.
Yeah.
And then on top of that is this problem which didn't exist back then and is in abundance now. And that is patience. Now, I call this a problem with absolute recognition that it is not a chosen problem. It's a problem that was not chosen. We didn't choose to be patient, nor did this generation choose to be impatient. Yeah. It's just the difference in the world that we are growing in. So when we were growing up in 1980s, 1990s, we had to wait for everything. There was no choice. You had to wait for your favorite Hindi songs that used to come only on Wednesday, 7 p.m. through this program called Chitrahar. And if, God forbid, there was no electricity at that point, you would only get it next week. There was no choice. You had to wait for a bus pass. You had to wait for a phone connection. You had to wait for a car. You had to wait for a watch. You had to literally wait for everything. Forget the reasons, but you had to. And you hated every moment of that. But it did train you on how to wait for things. And then there's today's generation, which were born in an era where everything is on demand. Yeah. You need a book, click. You need clothes, click. You need cabs, click. Food, click. Love, swipe right. Everything. Like it's at your command. Yeah. And that tricks them into believing that everything that you need in life can come on demand, including success, including fame, including respect, including recognition, including love, including contentment, including fulfillment. No, it doesn't. It just doesn't. That's just the nature of the animal. So you have this concoction where, and a deadly one at that, where there is lack of patience because of the world you were grown in or born into. And this plethora of choices that are constantly distracting you. And so you're constantly feeling like a loser. You're constantly feeling like a loser. When we felt like a loser, it was because our business wasn't working. Yeah. But there'll be founders that I speak to who feel like a loser because they're like, we aren't spoken enough. We aren't recognized enough. We aren't looked at favorably. People don't join us on the day of joining after accepting our offer letters. Like all of those are their measurements and barometers of success. When I'm like, dude, is the startup making money? Forget all of this. Yeah. Are you making money or not? Are your unit economics profitable or not? Do you have a pathway to become profitable or not? Is there an end game or not? Are you running out of money? Those are the bigger considerations as against what you are driven by or distracted by. And that I think is the big difference that's happening in the last 20 odd years.
Wow. I think that's a great way to put it because, I think while all of these amazing things around, popularity of startup founders does more good than harm, I do think for the 10-20% or whatever that number may be, it distracts enough and more good people as well from the primary objective, which is also counterproductive. So we have to take all of this with a pinch of salt, and that's where a lot of maturity, awareness is required to be exited in the ecosystem. And I think all of the actors alongside need to promote the right thing as well, and not just incentivize. I often wonder if Shark Tank incentivizes raising funds, right?
Exactly.
That can't be the sort of North Star that founders start chasing. Essentially because raising funds is a requisite for maybe growth companies, but you need to understand why you need the capital. So many people just say that we want to go to Shark Tank now. That can't be the genesis of your company, unfortunately.
You can't. And then there are congratulations all around. And I often say this, congratulating an entrepreneur on raising funds is like congratulating a chef on buying vegetables. Yeah. It's the input, bro. It's the input.
Yes.
It's not the output. The dish has to be made. Someone has to pay for it. Someone has to love it and love it enough that they come back for it. That's the job. Funding, great. Of course, it's a milestone. Please pat yourself on the back and get working the next day. But it's like the Indian culture where we congratulate each other when the bank passes our loan. Like it's just so fascinating. It's like, "Arey, loan pass ho gaya. And I was like, yeah, okay, of course, no, be happy that you're paying somebody an obnoxious amount of interest for something that you parked your own money in an FD for. Like it's literally your money coming back for you, more expensive.
Yeah.
But no, that's
That's
the
how it
way the
is.
world works.
Yeah. No, but that's fair. I'd love to also know on the business side, what are the changes that you've observed, right? Because you've gotten a front seat opportunity to witness e-commerce coming to India. You were early to getting, commerce to India on a more main scale scenario via coupons, via deals, via the work that you've done. But you've seen demonetization post that. You've then seen, the India internet wave of geo coming up. If you had to really lay how the Indian ecosystem has evolved purely from a business lens and what the India opportunity looks like, which is something that a lot of youngsters wonder, right? I don't want to go into white spaces. I just want to understand how you've seen the curve really evolve and how that has, made sense for you. And therein, where do we stand currently?
So, in my opinion, there have been three phases. Phase one was the elite phase, where there were very few people who had the money and the access to the internet. And they were often the same people. Sure. So, all credit card companies were chasing them, or commerce companies were chasing them, or content companies were chasing them, or advertising dollars were trying to monetize them. And that was the small, happy world. This was the 2000s in this country. And that's where the first seeds of a Make My Trip and a Naukri.com and a Shadi.com, they started emerging. Not surprisingly, the ones that did really well during that period were the roti, kapda, makan businesses, like the fundamentals, the staples. Because people didn't have enough money to go into discretionary. People didn't have enough money to say, oh, let me go and figure what it is to go on a vacation. Right? So MMT at that point of time was also just centered on flights. In fact, they started their focus on NRIs because that's where the money was. And then they came into mainstream, and with Air Deccan and everything that came about, it just blew up. But it was still flights and somewhat hotels, certainly not packages, and certainly not international destinations and all that they do today. Then came the next phase, which was, say, 2010s to 2020 or so. And the big seminal point on that was geo. What happened was money didn't increase disproportionately, but access did. So suddenly now millions of people had access to the internet. They didn't have the money. And India then became what is fancily called a DAO farm. And Kunal Shah has spoken about it actively, where there was this combination of international folks looking at India saying, oh my God, there are like millions of people. And if we turn the switch on, we suddenly get downloads by thousands per second. Maybe there's money to be made. What they didn't know was there was no money to be made. But still, there was slow, progressive economic growth. So the middle class became slightly better in its disposable income. Again, most of e-commerce remains staples. So it's electronics because it's cheaper, or it's now somewhat clothes, or it's certainly the fundamentals. We're not the eBay world where we're buying things and collectibles on auctions and, oh my God, let me get this fancy limited edition something. None of that has even happened. It's been cabs. It's been food, which went through a up and down, but now it's somewhat of a resurgence. It's, of course, been content for the longest time. And even within that, largely cricket and then entertainment. What I think is going to happen, and this phase is still on, by the way. Mm-hmm. I don't think this phase is going to end anywhere before 2030 or so. So we have certainly 5-6 years, in my opinion, of this phase. But what will happen is that once we get to about the $3,000, $3,500 per capita mark, which historically at least has been the tipping point. We've seen it in China. We've seen it in some other countries as well. You start getting enough people, because we are a large base, with both access and money. And that's when you see a third phase emerging, where it is not so much about the fundamentals as well, where the fundamental businesses will, of course, become mega. So you will have mega travel, you will have mega food, you will have mega e-commerce, you will have mega these fundamental verticals, but there'll also be enough business to be made in highly specialized verticals. Like there's unfortunately no reason, no, I use the word before and after. There's no reason that something as good as Urban Ladder should not have done well in India.
Yeah.
It's a great brand, well executed, but furniture is not. Because people are still like, I love the design, but I'll still make it from my local carpenter because it comes for 1/3. And I'm not going to pay this price of convenience of just getting it shipped and arranged and being passive about it. I like being active about it. I like being like, kar kyun nahi rahe ho, aur lunch zyada ho gaya hai, aur kal kyun nahi aa rahe ho, and like just this active nature of being involved. But we'll come to a point where we would love to be passive and we'll give far more importance to our time than our money. And that portion will always be small, but that small on a large base will be enough to fulfill a business model there. And there'll be interesting businesses that will emerge from that, which will be the nature of how we evolve as a country and our needs at that point of time. Of course, with the changing world, I don't know how AI will be. Like, I do believe that education is this mega industry that has never become big anywhere in the world. The biggest education company in internet will be like $4-5 billion market cap, which is not big enough at all by any measure. So I do feel that education is ripe for disruption, and with AI, with enough and more access and with paying capacity, India is one of those few countries where we could see a big business model emerge. Never mind the recent edtech pain that we are going through. All of that is just cleansing, in my opinion. I do believe healthcare is going to go through a massive, massive disruption. I do believe that food, not food tech, like food delivery, but food growing and supply chain is going to go through a massive disruption with climate change, with certainly AI, with people becoming more and more aware of health choices that they have to make, and healthcare then supporting that. And I have a very strong feeling that trading, which has been almost foundational for our economy for several centuries, will go through a fundamental shift through digital as well. And you're seeing enough B2B businesses taking that shape and form and becoming big. But I feel that it'll be possibly as big as the Amazons of the world today. And of course, a lot more. As I said, go back to what I said. My predictions are all bullshit. Don't take them seriously. But I often think about it, and I do feel that these three phases will certainly unfold. We're in phase 2, and we still have close to a decade to unfold.
Nice. I mean, no, this is very, very helpful. Again, I love how systematically you've broken that down. And yeah, as a student of Indian entrepreneurship, I concur to so much of it. And yeah, I think the large sentiment that India is the place to be is just very, very true. And entrepreneurship is this great leveler and, economic lever that you can really catch on to. And I feel I'm like a perfect example because as a youngster doing what I do, I could only imagine being in a position in India to be able to do it. So
Best place to be.
yeah. No, awesome. This has been very fascinating. I want to come to your entrepreneurial journey. And before we get into the phase of, let's say the nearby story, I want to understand the part of 2019. You made the decision to, of course, step down as CEO, move on further, and figure out what's next. What's well documented is why you decided to do that, which was, the company was going through a tough time. You realized you didn't need 3 founders, and that's why you decided to move on. What's also well documented is that you decided to then pursue content because it was natural to you, and COVID happened, and that became the means. What I'm very curious to know, and I'm sure other people also ask, is why not give like a venture-backed company another opportunity? I don't know if you've already mentioned this, but I'd love to know what your thinking principle as you're presuming 35 something at that time. You're of course very mature. You've done this. You know the trends. You know the opportunities. You have the muscle to raise money. You can build a team evidently. So you had all the let's say requirements or the recipe to build, let's say, a venture-backed play again. But you decided to do something different, which has of course played out wonderfully well. But I want to understand at that precise moment what the thinking process was when you decided not to pursue a company and do this instead.
It was clearly the experience of how venture capital works and doesn't work for a company. The reality is that venture capital is fascinating if it works for you and things work out. And we have enough and more examples to applaud in this ecosystem. We have wonderful examples of how without that capital, there was no way they could have made it thus far and, of course, been such grand successes. What's not often spoken about is what was the flip side of venture capital. So here's where we were at Nearby, for example. When I quit Nearby in 2019, we were doing nearly 500 to 550 crores of annual sales. We were profitable. We were by far the market leader in this space, which was growing slowly, but growing. And COVID hadn't happened. So we didn't know that, but we were in a good spot. If I were to ask anybody, would you be a proud owner of a 5 to 600 crore company, profitable, market leader? I think most people will say yes.
Absolutely.
But we were a failure. And the reason we were a failure is not anybody else's fault. It's completely ours, because we sold the dream that we would be a 5,000 crore company and not a 500 crore company. Because venture capital doesn't get excited by 500 crore companies. It wants 6,000, 7,000, at least $1 billion, which is 8,000, 8,500 crores and upwards. Because that's their business model. Their business model is large deployment of capital to get 20 to 30% ownership, and then to make a return on that ownership, the outcome needs to be in multiple billions of dollars. And that means by design, if you do not have on day one the confidence and the surety that you will be that, you're setting yourself up for failure. It's suicidal. Yeah. I don't think there's a better word for that. It's actually suicidal, because as a founder, that's going to be 100% of your life in that moment. It's going to be 100% of what you think of, 100% of how you govern yourself, 100% of your thoughts, your actions, everything. But for the VC firm, you're one of multiple bets that they've taken, and they know by design only a few of them will pan out, but they'll pan out so good that by the power law, their fund will be repeated and returned multiple times over. And that works out for them. And it clearly has successfully for a lot of VC firms, including the ones that we raised from. I didn't want to play those bets. I certainly didn't want to play those bets. Because the big realization I had, and someone was asking me the other day, what's the big mental shift that you made to be where you are right now? And I was like, being bootstrapped. 100% being bootstrapped. Because last year, we did about 27 crores of revenue, and we were about 25% EBITDA. And that means 6 to 7 crores of net profit after we've paid for everything. And as promoters, trust me, we're making the company pay for everything. Everything. It's more money than I know how to spend. And I know that I can easily compound this at 10, 15%, if not more, which means that we will easily be a 100 crore company or a 200 crore company in a decade or so. And I'm good with that. I'm absolutely good with that. Because I recognize the joy that I get in building this, as against killing myself building something which will be 10,000 crores and feeling like a failure every single day of my life until I get to that point. Most of which, no, I shouldn't say that because that's dishonest. Some of which is never going to be in my control. The outcome, the reasons of why we got to that point. Some of that will never be in my outcome, in my control. And I wouldn't want to play that at all. I just wouldn't. So I tell people this, and then that goes back to the conversation we had. Like it saddens me that people with a shop, with a restaurant, with a chocolate making setup, with a t-shirt store would go to Shark Tank and raise money and actually get it. Because they've just shot themselves.
Yeah.
They just have. And for no fault of theirs. It's never going to be a large outcome. And that's why, not surprisingly, you'll see most of the sharks, with all due respect to them, making deals now which are almost like loans and not equity.
Yeah.
He'd be like, no, here's the money and I get X% ownership and I get royalty. And until I get 3 times my money, you'll keep paying me that royalty. That's just a dignified loan.
Yeah.
And that's not betting. Like I would much rather have you say, you know what, this is not something you should raise money for ever, because trust me, even if this setup goes to 1 crore of revenue, you will have more money for yourself than you will ever need in life. And you'll be completely free of any shackles that have bound you so far. Make that wise call, as against being answerable to somebody who just gave you money when you thought that you would never make this kind of money.
Yeah. I think that's, again, incredibly wise and articulate to mention, because you have to recognize what kind of companies need venture money, and you have to know what you're signing up for. Yes. I think, unfortunately, it's now looked at as a proxy for any kind of capital that you need to start your business, but that is not true. Yes. And there are many other ways. So,
absolutely.
No, I think that's great to mention, and often I don't think it gets mentioned enough. So I'm glad that we're having the conversation around it. Coming back to the journey pre-2019, the interesting thing is that, as the age that you were in, you were taking a lot of first time, you were having a lot of first time experiences. They were a lot of highs and some lows, right? Talk to us about the empathy that we can develop towards the founder's journey when you're in the moment. In hindsight, of course, it's now, all well. But when you were in the moment, there was this rocket learning phase. Then there was this raising 17 million, largest checks, Ecoas cart. Then there was this, of course, laying off people. So there were these ups and downs. You also took ownership of your own company by pitching to the board. So Groupon to Nearby happened. Without going into details of events, I'd love to understand what some of those learnings in the moment as a founder were at scale, when you were responsible for a large collective where everybody was, believing and buying into the vision that you perhaps had at one point along with your co-founders. And then the tough calls that come along with it, and the happy moments that come along with it, the fulfillment that it follows.
It was intensely hard, man. It was really hard, and I wouldn't wish that upon anybody. But it's also baptism by fire, and I don't think I would be here if I hadn't gone through those experiences as well. Unfortunately, a lot of people had to suffer because of that. Like, it is almost like I owe my experiences to the death of self-pride of so many people. Because when you lay off people, it's never about the job. It's never about the job. It's always about the self-respect. And I don't know how many of the 80 odd people that we laid off still wake up feeling that they could have done more to not have been laid off. And I wish if there was any way for me to tell them that it wasn't their fault, it was all mine. It was just completely mine. And I just had to respond to a fiduciary responsibility that I had to protect the company at the cost that it came along with. But nothing prepares you for that. Frankly, nothing did. And I remember the all hands where I announced that people were laid off, and I broke down. And there were just emails coming in, even from people who were laid off, and they were just so warm and so accepting that I felt like I didn't deserve all of that, because I was doing something that was harming them. And that made it even worse, because there was this massive guilt now. And of course, the feeling of a failure. And it took time to recover, and it just began to dawn upon me that the only way to take charge was to become profitable and to take control of your own destiny, at least financially, if not otherwise. And we started working towards that. And what I loved was, I'd like to believe that the authenticity and the honesty with which we approached that, people saw through it and they stuck around. They believed in it till the last day. Even when I left, most of the team stayed and they continued to. They weren't like, oh my God, Ankur's leaving, so this is a pack of cards now. No, they weren't. It was all in it for the larger cause that we stood for. And I'm really proud of that. And I think I'm proudest of the culture that we built, because what I often say is that the culture will not help you grow as an organization as much, but it'll certainly save you when you're drowning. And you will drown. Everybody drowns. the question is, what saves you when you're drowning? And unfortunately, for a lot of businesses, there's nothing that saves them when they're drowning. But in our case, there was our culture. It was just people. It wasn't the business model. It wasn't an economic strength. It wasn't anything else that saved us, but the fact that our people continued to show up. And I don't know why, but they just did. And something worked in that. So I often tell founders, don't postpone the journey of building culture to someday when you have the time to do so.
Yeah.
It is just as important as building the business, because the early days will set the culture whether you like it or not, and you need to be in control of that culture. Because if you don't like it, you will not be able to change it later on. That's the definition of culture. You will have to force a change, and that force will always require effort, whether it's money, whether it's force that is emotional, mental, or any combination thereof. And that's just never worth it, because then you're again distracted by something that you ought not to do. So please take charge of that culture. And there is nobody responsible for that, certainly not HR, who's responsible for culture, but the founder. And it's far more important to have a culture than to have the right culture.
Yeah.
And there's so many people who will be like, oh, something like an Amazon, or it's brutal culture and blah, blah, blah. Well, you know what? People sign up knowing that that's the place they will have to be at. And it works for some and it doesn't work for some.
Yeah.
And you self-select. And that'll be true for every place. But a place where you don't even know what the culture is, that's a shithole. Because then everybody's playing their own game and everybody's trying to pretend that that's the right thing to do. And that's a mess. You don't want to be in that sort of place. So it's far more important to have decisiveness that this is the way we work. And it's now your choice whether you like it or not. And we'd be respectful of that. We won't force anybody. And that's why I admire some people and some startups or companies in India which have a very strong culture. And a lot is spoken about, oh, it's not the right culture, blah, 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 blah. No, who cares? It's a very strong culture. It's very clearly experienced, if not articulated. And then it becomes your choice whether you want to experience it or not.
Yeah, so true. It actually takes back. So the first episode we recorded was called Defining Culture. And I distinctly remember you mentioning how culture is the oxygen of the room. It's the rule book. It's the way people behave in the absence of a rule book. And I absolutely love that. I think the consistency in your belief in culture, and also how you talk about your team as well in public as well, is just commendable. So I think that's a trail that's been very common across all of your conversations, and you valuing just the human aspect of capitalism is very, very deeply entrenched. And I wish, again, that's also another thing that is better understood and recognized than left unsaid, and for the future when you have to course correct. So fascinating. I think this has been great. Now I'd love to take another direction and come to the creator journey, the one that is more public in nature and more known. But it's been an exciting one. What people don't realize as often is it's not a wave that you caught on to. It's just purely out of passion. You started in 2017. You were very early to LinkedIn. So you've been doing this for a while, and this is definitely not an overnight success. I'd love to understand how you think about being a creator when it comes to, I wouldn't say the negative impacts of it, but fundamentally what it does to people, because it's eventually a dopamine hit. You're trying to play to an emotion which will incite something from the audience, right? It's very difficult to distinguish value and what will succeed, win, grow there. How do you as a creator retain your foundational values? Because you definitely are somebody with very strong foundational values, yet know that growth is a occupational hazard, if I may, and play the algorithm.
To answer that question, it's important to recognize how we think about content in the first place.
Sure.
When I say we, I mean the team and I. We were very clear from day one, Jivraj, that this content play is not a sales engine for us. What I mean is, it's not designed to make us money, and it's not designed to sell anything to people. Okay. So we consciously don't have anything behind a paywall. We were discussing before the podcast started, we don't have ads running. You also don't have ads running on YouTube. We do anywhere between 35 to 40 million views a month. We could easily be making over 2 crore rupees a year just by turning on ads. We don't. Call it foolish, call it whatever. Same for Instagram. We don't have any subscriptions. We don't have any paid groups. None of that. Like, so all the content is completely free, irrespective of the platform. The only paid content piece are our books. And I wish I could make it free, but there are economics behind it. So what purpose does the content serve? It is not to grow. It is not to become multi-million follower accounts. None of that was the aspiration, and it certainly isn't in our daily conversations. It is to act as a trust engine. We are a trust-efficient country. We don't trust people easily. We have grown up with the belief that dal mein kuch kala hai. So if people are nice to you, there is a catch, and you have to be on your guard. And there have been enough and more cultural nuances that have set that as a foundation that don't trust people at face value. What that also means is if you do trust somebody, you suddenly trust them to the extent of irrationality. So, which is the most trusted brand in the country? Tata. But what's fascinating to me is that we trust Tata so much that we are ready to buy namak from Tata, cars from Tata, schools from Tata, housing from Tata, flights from Tata, hotels from Tata, steel from Tata. Literally everything that Tata could make, we're ready to buy it from because it's just Tata. And this conglomerate view is not only, but often found in trust-efficient countries or cultures. You don't find the equivalent in the West. Like there's a GE, but that's only literally a GE. There is no large conglomerate in the US, for that matter, even in Western Europe. There will only be in trust-efficient countries because once trust is established, it gives them a superpower to literally extend beyond their capabilities. So content for us acts as the same engine. I want to be helpful and I want to be consistent, and hopefully people see me as authentic. And if these things come about, then they will trust me with my word and my face. Now, why is that important? It's important because I am an entrepreneur and I'm building what is an education startup. It's by the name of WebVeda. And WebVeda is an online school where the focus is give top-class education at a very affordable price to the masses. So I'm not this elite school. I am completely at the opposite end of the spectrum where courses are very affordable. They come with 100% refund policies. They are fully on demand, and they are designed to help anybody irrespective of their economic strata and their access. As long as they have a phone and the internet connection, they could be a student. And to do that at scale, you need trust-based distribution, which is what this content has given us. So it was a very clearly laid out plan that if this content works, and it will if you're consistent with it and authentic, then that will feed into the courses side and the startup, which has this mandate of reaching out to millions of students, hopefully at some point. We're at 400,000 students and an average price point of about 750 rupees. Again, as I said, 100% refundable. Our refund rates are less than 5%. That's despite the fact that we have a no questions asked refund policy. There are people coming back after 1.5 years saying, hey, I love the course, but I need the money right now. And we're like, take the money, bro. It's yours. Totally okay. Your life is hopefully going to help. Our life is not going to change because of this. And we run it like that. And every quarter there's a new course that comes up. I'm the lead instructor right now. Maybe tomorrow's world there'll be other instructors that coming in, bringing in their own expertise. And what I'll be able to do is lend my trust to them. Because if I say, hey, Jivraj is good at this, then hopefully people will pay attention because they trust me. And that trust will then flow to Jivraj. So that's the thesis. And the thesis has panned out so far. Yeah. And it seems to be working. And we don't know where it will take us. But it's very, very clear that the game of content was never vanity, was never growth, was never size or scale. It was just purely and purely trust. And to build that trust, you just had to show up. And even if you make a mistake, and I've made mistakes, be the first person to raise your hand and own up and say, hey, I fucked up and I'll do better the next time. And you just keep me accountable for that.
Very interesting. So create for trust and use the trust in a way to add value back through education
Yes.
is your mantra. Um, Curiously enough, I'm sure you've been asked this or you've wondered about it, but a lot of creators eventually end up building companies on top of what they've built, and use their distribution to sell products which are authentic or that may be in question, but to sell something valuable to the audience in the form of a product. You've often mentioned you don't want to do that. What is the thesis behind that personally, and how do you think other creators can borrow that adage?
No one gets up in the morning wanting to see an ad. No one gets up in the morning wanting to see an ad. No one gets up in the morning wanting to buy anything. We buy because we are driven by impulse. We buy because there is some lizard side of our brain just getting activated by something that we come across, whether it's FOMO, whether it's anything else. And we were very clear that if we begin to sell something through our content, people will trust us lesser because they'll be like, there's a catch. Like, he's not
There's an
pure.
agenda.
There's an agenda. There's something behind this that may not be visible, but it's going to be. And we didn't want that. So our marketing engine, which is a very active engine to the point that people are irritated by it, I admit, is a completely independent engine to our content. Our marketing is not run from the same channels as we run our content. There is no marketing of our content. All of it is just marketing of the courses that we run. And all of them have my face, which is what makes it even more irritating. But the idea is if there's trust that has been built here, that will perhaps flow here as well. So if people see an ad and that has me and they know of me, they'll be like, okay, I know of him and I trust him, so I can perhaps consider this. Or if they don't know of me and if they were to go and Google me up, they will see years and years of hopefully helpful content that will over time get them to trust. So data, our landing page conversion on a first ad is anywhere between 5 to 7%, which is reasonable. It's not out of whack, but it's also not low. But if people see the ad, come to the landing page and not buy, but see the ad again, and if they were to then Google me up or go to any of my content pieces, then the landing page conversion is nearly 36%.
Oh, wow.
Like, it's 1/3. Because
Wow.
people have bought into it at that point. They just have. It's a slam dunk.
Yeah.
Now, if all of this was happening without the content, these numbers would be far, far lower. And they would never make sense at the economics of which I want to run the business at. If I was running this course at 20,000, 70,000, I wouldn't have to worry about any of this. But because I'm running this course at 549 rupees and 749 rupees, I have to ensure conversion at these numbers. Otherwise, this will never be sustainable.
Right.
So this distribution-based or this trust-based distribution is mandatory for this business to work. And that's why we mentored it. And that's why it was very clear that even if we end up selling something, you know what, you'll milk your audience once, twice. You can't milk them forever.
Yeah.
And it'll be dead because you would have lost the trust and you would have milked all of it as well. So it's so short term that why would you ever do that? But the long term is just keep creating value here and keep speaking about what you have to offer in a curated form at a price point and let the two of them coexist but never interact with each other.
Fair. I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you have a POV on how other creators should be doing this as well? Because this creator economy thing seems to be decently real, at least from the conversation of it. There is so much around how creators can monetize because this has now become a viable career option and an aspirational one for that matter. So a lot of people doing this on a full-time basis will wonder that the brands will eventually not keep sending you money. So how do you eventually make money?
I really feel that when you're young, you should not worry about what's the right way to do it. You should just worry about experiencing things, as many things as you can. Okay. Because it's very clear that somebody who's starting in their 20s as a creator is not going to be doing this for the rest of their life. but they'll have a story to tell. And they would have experienced so much, both good and bad, that they will hopefully wisen up from that experience to figure out what they could eventually do. So I would certainly not have any recommendation for anybody. I believe that I am very lucky that I started this seriously at the age of 40. So I have nothing to prove. And I'm thankfully wise enough to not fall for the dopamine shots that I get through any of the vanity metrics that others may be chasing. And I'm just playing my game very clearly of what I want to do. But I'm very sure that if I was 20, I would not be saying all the things that I'm saying right now. And I certainly wouldn't be as wise. It's only because I've been an entrepreneur and I've gone through that from day one, I saw this as a business and not as a creation. I didn't ever, even for a second, fool myself into saying, oh, I'm a creator. No, I am an entrepreneur and this is my raw material. And just like the raw material never stops at a factory until you produce the finished product, the same way your content is the raw material that never ever stops, because the day it stops, then your outcome and your output also stops. And that may be the day when you wish to stop, but it can't be the day where you're like, oh, I'll do without the raw material. You can't.
Fair. Interesting. Yeah, I do think the wisdom that you had at the time of starting and the experiences have helped you also build a playbook around it,
Yes.
which a lot of people don't have, purely because a lot of things are happening by chance. It's a lot of experimentation, but with you it's been very methodical, and that's been super fascinating to know. There's the other side, which of course you've also been very candid to express opinions on, but the dark side of creating is that everybody has an opinion in today's day and age, rightly so, but sometimes that can be hurtful and not very wise in the moment to people who have a public persona like yourselves. How do you, even in the most secure version of yourself, deal with any public negativity, any rash comments, and does that ever get to you, considering that you are well intentioned and you know that everything that you are doing is in the public best interest, and anybody who knows you will testify to it?
Yeah, it's a very valid question, but I'm surprised when people ask me, because if you know that you're well intentioned, then why would anything ever affect you?
Yeah.
It's
ironical.
it's just ironical. It's convoluted logic, because I am very secure. I am extremely self-aware. So I know exactly what's good with me and what's not. I'll be the first one to admit my fallacies and my flaws. I'll be the first one to admit that I've made a mistake. I'll be the first one to hopefully correct it and try not to make it again. And I'm like, how can somebody be affected by an ad so much?
Yeah.
Like, what could possibly be going on in this person's life to be hurling abuses at a complete stranger for showing up on their YouTube feed? There must be something really broken in their life to be going through that, because no one gets up in the morning saying, hey, I want to fuck over Ankur Warikoo's life. I'm nobody in their life. Yeah. So if they got to that point, they were triggered, and that trigger had nothing to do with me. It was to do with what's happening in their life. One thing that I have really benefited from is, as a public figure, you're at the receiving end of a lot of feedback. Yeah. Not always in the right tone, as you pointed out, but you're also at the receiving end of a lot of praise, which is, with all due respect, not helpful. Because when people say you're really good, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And if people say you suck, that doesn't mean anything as well. So I am constantly, and I'm a sucker for feedback, because that's genuinely one thing that I seek, and I know it has helped me so much in my life, that being a public figure has given me access to complete, free, flowing feedback. Yeah. And it becomes my job to remove the tonality of that and just try and interpret the message from it. So if somebody is really shouting at me and calling me BCMCs and all those things and saying your ads suck, I have to be wise enough and mature enough to remove all the abuses and just say your ads are far more frequent than they should be. Because if I were to fix that, I only become a better version of who I am. Like, it's unbelievable what a gift this is. And if I were to fix something that people have called me out for, whatever it is, I'll only become a better version of who I am. So I love being in that spot where I have the wisdom to filter out the tonality, and I am in a spot where all of this just keeps hitting me at a velocity that was not possible a few years back. But I don't, it's, there is something very empowering to be kind when people are not kind to you.
Yeah.
And I cannot describe that, but I find joy and I actually get a kick if I'm able to diffuse somebody who's unkind. I'll start by addressing them by their name, if they have a name. And that's like the simplest thing you can do to diffuse somebody, because no matter how big a mean-spirited person you are, if somebody were to call you by your name, it takes a complete different level of being mean-spirited to still be mean-spirited. So that diffuses them. I will thank them for their feedback. I will acknowledge whatever they feel is right or wrong. Like, here's a good example. We recently launched a course on content writing as a career. So make writing a career, that's the name of the course. I am now an author. I earn upwards of 1 crore in royalty every year because the books have done really well, and I'm very grateful for that. So we had a still ad which said, don't think writing can become a career? Question mark. Make over 1 crore a year by writing online. And somebody on LinkedIn called me out saying that that's very clickbaity. It is not realistic. And it is exactly the fraud kind of ads that scam people. And it wasn't, in my opinion, in the right tone. But the message is very clear. The ad is clickbaity because it lacks context. It doesn't say that I make 1 crore, so I think you can too. And it will take you 15 years to get to that point, but you could.
Yeah.
So none of that nuance is there. It just sounds like, "Arey, ye course loge to crorepati ban jaoge," which isn't certainly true by any measure. So I responded publicly to the LinkedIn post, and I said, "We're taking down the ad. We'll change the content of it. I accept the flaw that it is. Here's the reason why we stated it in the first place, so that you know that we weren't lying as such, and keep the feedback coming." And you then suddenly had so much goodwill come through because people are like, "Oh my God, we don't remember the last time such a adult conversation happened online."
Yeah.
Which is what just genuinely gives me joy. Like, I felt this kick writing that, saying, let's see how this is received. Forget by the world, by the person who wrote the original post. And he was also fairly gracious about it and very adult about it as well. But I love to be in that position of power.
No, that's amazing. I was just trying to wonder, it's almost challenging to find a flaw in any of your thinking processes, considering how secure you are. And thankfully also, as I was framing the question, I realized that the hate or whatever we might want to call it is, I'm guessing, in the larger scheme of things, less than like 1%. There is so much more admiration that is evident, that even a non-secure person will be way more grateful in most aspects than whatever 1% negativity might exist. So I think that's the best part. What I want to understand, Ankur, this is something that you mentioned briefly as well. Feedback purely from results is also the best part about social media, in my opinion. You just put something out there and the results show. I'd love to understand, in your years of building very strong sort of following, what do you think makes people click? Almost to understand not what content works, but what are humans in general usually craving? Because you've now been able to do this well on LinkedIn, which is very different. You've been able to do this over Twitter, which also is very, very different. You've done this over YouTube, which is again very different, very intentional. And you've been able to do this on Instagram, which is more, let's say more free flowing, more in the moment, more in the moment. So yes, it flows, but very different things. So your data points on what consumers like must be a goldmine. I would love to hear if you have a framework around, if you do these 5 things, this will appeal to an audience.
You don't need 5, you just need 1. And that is, make people believe that they are right and the world needs fixing. Now that, I'll give you an example actually. So here's the example. The example is, on LinkedIn, if somebody writes a post, which by the way is the right post, that seeking feedback is your responsibility. It's not your manager's responsibility to give you feedback. What you essentially do is you are making the person who's reading it responsible for their own self. People don't want that. They don't want that. It is the right thing, but they don't want that. What they want is to believe that they are right and the world is in some way wrong. Now, you can't alter the message to make them feel this way. So you still have to run that fine line where you're passing that message on, but in a manner that makes them feel validated and makes them feel that the world has to do a lot more work than it is. So here's a way of doing that. Seek the manager who loves giving you feedback as much as you love receiving it from them. Now, when you do that, you're essentially changing the tone in a way where you haven't changed the core thesis of it. But now what you're saying is the manager also has to do their work, and it's not just you. They can't be like, oh, it's not my responsibility, it's theirs to ask. And if they ask, then I give it. So you haven't changed the core message. What you've essentially done is you sweetened the message by saying, hey, the hard work is not just on you, it's also on your manager. And the same construct works everywhere. People don't want to be told that their life is their responsibility. What they want to hear is their life is a shared responsibility. And whatever manner you are sharing that in, whether it's on LinkedIn or on Instagram or on Twitter or someplace else, you will stand to benefit. Wherever you are making it look like, oh, you are in charge, you are in control, you got to go and pick it up and you got to make it happen, people will love you for that rush that they get, but it's not going to make any big dent over a long period of time.
Got it. Wow, I love that. I think that's going to be useful very much for me as well. This is very interesting. I have a couple of final questions. One on your creator journey as an author. I think that's a very crucial one. And on the education piece. But as an author, you've now released 3 books. I actually want to play devil's advocate here and want to ask you that so much of what a lot of people do and think is that a book is going to be their life's work, which is going to be very timeless. It just feels very difficult in theory to believe that one individual will have 3 books to write in 3 years or in 2 years. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I want to understand, how do you feel about being an author? How do you feel about a book as a means of content, which is very timeless in nature? And why not do less, but maybe have, perhaps more expanded value per book, if that ever makes sense? Not to say that the books don't in and of themselves have value, but to just understand the framework of why many books, but not one or couple.
Sure. So there are clearly 2 forms of content creation. One is what I call the magnum opus way, or the Mr. Beast way. And the Mr. Beast way is you put your heart and soul and your blood and sweat into making this one big ass production that blows everyone's mind. So it's the Christopher Nolan. It's pick anyone else. even from an Indian context. Like, think of it like the Amir Khan out there. And then there is the process-based content production, which is clinically churning out. So think of Balaji Telefilms. Every single day there is episodes and episodes and episodes and episodes and episodes being shot. Think of just daily vlogs that are coming through. Think of anybody who's just constantly posting. My favorite example, Gary Vaynerchuk. That dude is not about individual numbers. He is about collective impact. So if you have enough and more avenues of firing, and if you're doing a reasonably good job of firing, collectively they will add up to significance. While somebody like a Mr. Beast would be like, no, my one video will hit 500 million views and I will put $7 million into making that. Both of them can coexist and both of them should coexist.
Absolutely.
I'm certainly not the magnum opus guy. I am not the one who will be, I'll write one book and that'll be the book of my life. One video, that'll be the video of my life. One podcast, that'll be the podcast of my life. No, I am a very clinical process-driven individual. And for me, creativity is a process. It's not a flash in the pan that you get in one moment and then it makes it or doesn't. So a book a year is what I have signed up for, because if I'm producing nearly 150 videos a year on YouTube and 365 reels on Instagram and 365 shots on YouTube and 52 newsletter pieces a year and 365 podcast episode a year, why can't I write a book a year? Because I don't have to write the book. The book will be a curated version of all that content, not just of that year, but for the last 18 years that I've been creating content.
Absolutely.
And all that I need to do is just to organize it in a fashion that's consumable, that acts as an artifact far beyond any algorithmic video will last, and most importantly, acts as a nice flow to somebody drowning in information in today's world. None of the content, for example, in Make Epic Money, which is my latest book, is new. I've spoken about it endlessly in my videos. But it gives a flow to people who are missing that on any platform. Sure. Because even if they were to watch the best video of my personal finance videos on YouTube, there'll only be one small element of the entire story, and they wouldn't know what to watch next.
Yeah.
And they'll be dependent on the algorithm, which also doesn't know what to watch next, because there is no series that has been made. It's just topics by topics by topics. And what the book has done is weave those topics together.
Got it. I love that. I think in a world of disorder, books can act as a very strong means of discipline, system, order. And that is much required. I think I seek to books now because I'm just overwhelmed with the kind of information available. And as you mentioned as well, you mentioned this about your kids very often, that reading is a fundamental habit. Yes. So I think these things help you grasp information in a very different consumption mode as well.
Exactly.
So I love that. Awesome. The interesting thing, and before we get to education, is that even within content, there are a lot of people who, let's say, start different channels. You try to replicate the same things with other sort of aspects within content to build almost like a media empire. You've, of course, chosen to build the education empire as opposed to, let's say, spread yourself thin across channels. But do you think that's also something that is on the cards, or do you think, education is going to be more primary in nature?
Education is 100%. That's where my focus is. That's where 80% of my energy also goes. Content, it seems like I'm on social media 24/7, but I'm hardly on it. I don't consume it myself, so I'm a big hypocrite by that measure. And the time that goes into producing all of that content is less than 8 hours a week. So it takes no more than a day of my week to produce all the content, and we produce 63 pieces of unique content every week. So all of that is produced in just 8 hours, and it just goes into different parallel universes and work streams, and people do their job and it comes together. All of it is remote, all of it is async, and it just works like a well-oiled engine. And we love it that way, and we wouldn't have it any other way. But education is where a lot of effort goes in, because that's thinking. It's designing the curriculum. It's executing that curriculum. It's thinking of what the quintessential student is, who are they? What are we going to tell them? Why does it matter to them? What should be the price point? What should be the marketing angle? All of those nuances, and of course the upgrades that keep happening, because these are all lifetime access courses. They are not, you don't get them for a limited period, you get them for life. So we have to then continue supporting the student in any change that happens in the curriculum as well.
Lovely, lovely. I think that really helps. As we end the conversation, I'd love to go just very quickly deeper on education. I recently came across and started doing Instagram further, and I wanted to educate myself further because I was finding a lack of depth in my processes, and after a while, I just ran out of ideas, right? And so I actually enrolled into your course
Okay.
on Instagram because, of course, you're very trusted. I would love to learn from you. I am still yet to go through the complete bit, but the reason I mention is that you have these amazing diverse courses and you're building a very strong engine to make that happen. However, traditionally, when we look at edtech, the problems have been high CACs, low fulfillment rates, many different things that I'm sure you're familiar with. I'd love to draw a parallel and understand how you differentiate. You've spoken about the digital marketing side of things. You've, of course, spoken about the courses itself. But as a company, right, in education, how do you look at the entire model? How do you look at course curriculum? How do you look at research for it? Some of these courses seem extremely niche. I would argue that, how to grow on Instagram is extremely niche. Yet something like time management is very, very general, broad based, and it's not discipline led yet, right? So it's not on, let's say, I don't know, engineering or like business management or like growth, all of that. How do you think about the broad vision on like education as a company?
Sure.
I would love to understand.
Absolutely. So there are multiple nuances to this. One is we want to be a life school. What is a life school? A life school is not following any curriculum. It's not meant to give you any degree. And it's certainly not directly applicable to the profession that you are in. Okay. It'll give you tools that everybody ought to have and will need to get good at living life, whether it's managing your time, it's managing your money, it's communications, it's side incomes, it's thinking of all of those nuances, which are called adulting. Right? So it basically is an adulting school.
Okay.
Now with that, there were a few things that we were very clear on. Number one, we didn't want to run live courses because they are time consuming. They have limited span in terms of people that can impact in one go. And they also, by virtue of being time limiting, become very expensive because the instructor, if it's a good one, will value their time a lot, and that then suddenly becomes a cost equation. So we wanted it to be fully on demand. But the challenge of fully on demand is they have very poor completion rates because they're largely driven by the motivation of the learner themselves, and there's very little that's supporting them in that journey. So we came up with a very interesting model that seems to be working so far, and that is we launch every course with a live course, but we select the students that we will take for that live course. And it's completely free for them. So it's a 100% scholarship batch, as we call it, and it's a founding batch. And I will personally run the batch. So for example, the latest course that is launching next quarter is launching a courses business, because a lot of people would want to become teachers. They don't know what it is to launch a courses business because most of them know how to make one, but don't know how to market one or deliver one or using technology to do so, blah, blah, blah. So we'll go through all of those fine aspects. And we'll look for people. So we'll have a very elaborate admission process, and we'll handpick 30 students at best who will be given access to this founding batch. And then we'll run this course with them for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever the time is. And we'll record every single interaction, everything. All the classes will be recorded, all the conversations and interactions will be recorded, all the questions will be recorded, the answers will be recorded, the community sessions will be recorded, so on. And that will then become the recorded course. What that has done psychologically is people feel they're part of a batch, because I'm not standing in front of a blackboard teaching random things or with just a PPT dry speaking into the camera. I'm animated and I'm calling on people and I'm responding to questions, and all of that is happening live in the moment. It's not designed and it's certainly not prompted. So people begin to feel as if they're part of a batch, and that surprisingly increases the completion rate. So our completion rates as compared to 30-40% at best in the industry are about 72%, which is great because that means that nearly 3/4 of people go through the course incomplete. They're also then very affordable because the additional cost for us to sell another course is zero. We don't have to bear any cost. There's no time being spent, nothing whatsoever. We didn't want to have a live element. So every course will come with one live session a month, just one a month. But that month, that live session becomes very intense. So there are multiple hundreds of people that join in, and we have a good Q&A session. We record that as well. It feeds back into the curriculum. Interesting content pieces from that recording are added back into the core curriculum. So every month, the course also becomes richer and richer and richer, and will continue to till we do all of that. That's our feeding mechanism of building it. This way, we keep our cost really low. Our trust engine ensures that we make money on every sale. We don't lose money ever on any sale.
So your CAC is always less than
So our CAC is always less than, forget LTV, our CAC is always less and the price
cost
point of
price.
that course itself. We will always make money, and we will then have the ability to launch a course every quarter. And there are multiple extensions to this now. We only do it in Hindi and English. We could do it in regional languages. We certainly want to do it in international languages. We want to be there in every non-English speaking country in the world where English is a second language, because it appeals to that, right? So Africa and Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe, those are the places that we would love to be at, because these courses are also very, I'd say, global in nature, and they're not specific to India. And with AI coming in, there's just massive disruption that will happen. Like, so my digital avatars will be there everywhere, teaching a course on demand to people basis the curriculum that we've designed as a core content piece, and just take it from there.
Amazing. I think that's going to be revolutionary, and already the work you're doing is brilliant. 400,000 you mentioned, and counting. So love that. I think getting a complete overview of that was something I was looking forward to, because you mentioned in bits and pieces, but to have the comprehensive sort of overview is very, very helpful. This has been really wonderful. All that I imagined it would be and more. As we end the conversation, I have a series of final questions that I ask most guests. This is more attuned to, let's say, the pattern that I've recognized that I want to derive from successful people, at least in the traditional definition of it. To you, I'd love to ask very quickly some of those.
Sure.
One of them, and it's interesting, I would love to hear your answer here, is what do you fear? If there is anything, and I'm sure there must be something.
Loss of my loved ones, for sure. That's the biggest fear.
Got it. If you could highlight one superpower out of all that you might have, what would that be?
My adherence to routine and process.
Awesome. If you could highlight the definition of success, what would that attune to?
The ability to do whatever you want to do without caring two hoots about what the world thinks of you.
Brilliant. You mentioned how wealth is a more important freedom aspect to life. You've also mentioned how you spread wealth. For somebody who is just starting out, how do you think they should define wealth?
Wealth should be your way to define or buy your freedom, not buy things. So think of money as a way that lets you make choices in life, or creates choices for you in life, as against forces you into some choice that you have no other choice from. That's the purpose of money. So the choice to eat healthy or not, the choice to work or not, the choice to work as long as you want or not, the choice to stay in a certain city or not, the choice to travel or not, the choice on how you want to travel or not, the choice to read or not, the choice to watch a certain kind of content piece or not. All of those are choices that we get to make. Unfortunately, not all of them are free, but the ability of money is to allow you to create those choices so that you can make the choice that you wish to make, as against be forced to pick one.
Amazing. I think I've read a lot of what you've written about money and wealth, and that defines so much of how I look at it. So it's very, very refreshing to hear from the horse's mouth. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is also, while your career trajectory is very unconventional, it is also very conventional, considering you've done consulting, you've done MBA, you pursued at some point PhD. I'd love to understand what you think the role of conventional sort of methodologies, especially things like MBA, consulting jobs, and these aspirational societal constructs really hold in a person's life.
For me, they are avenues of getting predictable experiences. An MBA done from a really good school very predictably will give you great exposure, a wonderful network that you can rely on, and self-discovery. But if you use it to get a job, that's a very poor outcome of an MBA, because you could have perhaps got that job someplace else as well. The conventional path of going for a consulting role after an MBA is very predictable, because it will get you to work with very smart people on really complex business problems, travel the world, get to meet people that you otherwise would not have, work on multiple industries in very short periods of time. So have a steep learning curve to understand what you are going through and make sense of it, and do it repeatedly to build your muscle around that. That's wonderful outcomes. But if you were to use it to make more money than your batchmates from college, then that's a poor outcome of just a consulting job. You could have done it by trading as well if you wanted to. Yeah. So I do feel that what conventional paths give is predictability of these experiences that are immensely valuable. They come almost by design. And unfortunately, most people don't treat them for that. They think of them as ways of being predictable in your financial outcomes or your professional success. But that could happen several other ways as well, because the world's opened up. Sure. What it offers is something which is very predictable in terms of experiences and outcomes.
I agree, and I think I'll borrow this from you. You mentioned a lot of times that the world is designed for comfort around us. Yeah. A lot of these predictable, conventional things seem less risky, more comfortable, absolutely, and bring us this false sense of being all right with our situations. And I think that's something to avoid, as you mentioned. The world is designed for comfort. You have to be the one avoiding it. This has been brilliant. The last two questions. One is on the entrepreneurship piece, considering you also are in touch with amazing founders. You've been a founder yourself. I don't think learnings are prescriptive, but maybe negatives are sometimes. So if you had to highlight three things that you shouldn't do, three for the lack of a better number, sure, but more to say that these are things that you should avoid in the entrepreneurial journey, what would that be?
One is to build fixed costs before you actually have revenue coming in. Fixed costs are fixed, and that means that you have no option but to bear them. But they'll also be the reason why you will sink far faster, because it'll become the weight of the business that will pull you down. Number two, to outsource culture building, or worse, to postpone culture building, because as I mentioned, it's not going to necessarily help you grow, but it will certainly be the one that protects you or saves you when you're drowning. And number three, stop listening to the customer, or worse, try to sell them what you have made. Nobody cares what you have made. What they care about is whether something that you have works for them or not. So instead of selling what you've made, make what they will buy. And that will mean giving up on your ego. That will mean perhaps reimagining everything that you thought your product or your service to be, starting all the way from scratch, but listening intently to the only person that matters, and that's the customer, because they're the ones who are going to make this business or not.
Brilliant. I think those are very, very articulate things in terms of what not to do when starting up. For the last question, this is as stereotypical as it gets, but one that I would love to hear an answer on. Let's go back memory lane. And if you could go back to the time when you were pursuing your PhD, right, let's say, and deciding to come back, if with all the years of wisdom that you have now, you could send yourself a message, what would you tell yourself?
It's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. Just bet on yourself and it's going to be okay. I think that's the only message, and I often speak about this. There's no way that I could have predicted that I would be here 20 years from the very day that I came back to India. And if there was even somebody who claimed to be a time traveler from the future who said, hey, you will have 10 million followers on social media, you would have written 3 best-selling books, you would be invited by top colleges and companies to speak to them, they'll give you lots of money to do so, and you'll be working for less than 20 hours a week and making more money than you can spend, and you will have love and respect coming in from people. I'd be like, no, just whatever you're smoking, just stop smoking that, because there's no way that I could have planned or worked towards being here. And I think I did what was the only thing I knew. I just continued to bet on myself. And thankfully, as I said, those bets paid off. And I'm okay. So I wish I can go back to that 24-year-old Ankur who was very, very tense, very nervous, very scared of what the future held for him, and just said, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
Lovely, lovely. I think that's a lovely message to end the conversation on. Thank you so much, Ankur,
Thank
for
you,
being
Raj.
such a kind person to share all of your learnings, very heartfelt. This has been lovely. I've always wanted to have another conversation with you, and I'm so glad we could make this happen.
I am so glad that we did this. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.